Okay, I am recording this. Hopefully I won't have to listen to all the roofing noises, and hopefully you guys won't have to listen to all the roofing noises because we've been listening to it all week. So, um, all right. A couple of years ago, I think at this point, sadly, the Oxford High School shootings were 2 years ago, I believe. I think that was in 2022 or 2021, the Ethan Crumbley situation. We had been doing trainings on crisis intervention and de-escalation up until that point, but after the Oxford High School shootings, we met as a management team here and we put together a protocol for accepting referrals for potential school shooters. And at that point, we talked a lot about what we could do or what we could offer to the schools in terms of crisis intervention and coming in and trying to help after a school shooting situation and so forth. Fortunately, and maybe it's because we have gotten better at spotting some of these potential school shooters, we haven't had an incident in 2024. It doesn't mean that, sadly, we probably won't, but that was the reason that we decided that we were going to do this. And we also decided that we were going to try to get all of you trained in what's called the NOVA model of critical incident stress debriefing. So I'm really happy that you all have come to this training today. We're going to talk a lot about what happens to your brain during a crisis because it happens to everybody. You don't choose it, you don't pick it, it just happens. We're going to talk about the whole run, hide, fight scenario that the schools have developed, which is kind of a variation on the fight, flight, freeze syndrome. And we're going to go over the NOVA model. The NOVA model is called critical incident stress debriefing. It's really skills that I think you all should have in terms of being able to do this and perform this service in a crisis. We had an incident, I'm here in DeBary. We had an incident a couple of years ago at Florida United Methodist Children's Home where the security guard was killed. It was just a really tragic year. And two of the residents ran away and broke into a house. They were 12 and 14 years old and found a lot of weapons, and police were called and they tried to shoot at the police and they were eventually apprehended, but the security guard did die from his injuries. And after all of that happened, and I believe that was 2021, we did talk to FUMSH about letting us come over and do a critical incident stress debriefing for the staff, because the staff that were on call, the staff that were on the campus when all of this happened, were really demoralized. And as with anything that happens like this, of course, Channel 9 was there, Channel 2 was there. They were hounded by reporters for days after this happened. And we did talk to the management about letting us do that. It didn't end up happening. I think there was just so many other things going on around the campus trying to get all this calmed down. But we did have some of the staff who opted to come over here because we're only a few miles from the main campus. And I met with some of them and we tried to talk them down, tried to help them to understand that some of what they were going through is that typical fight, flight, or freeze, and that kind of typical after a crisis PTSD. So these are the objectives. This is what we're going to be dealing with today. I want you to be thinking as we go through this about anything that's happened in your life. We've all had things that have happened that have been unexpected crises. And if you really look at what happened to you in those instances, you will see that your brain elected one of these three things. Your brain elected to fight, your brain elected to flee, or it elected to freeze. And it isn't something that you choose. It's not something that you say, okay, I just got in a terrible car accident and I think I'm going to freeze. It doesn't work like that. It's what happens to your brains, and it's what happens to everybody's brains during a crisis. So that's our goal here today, and that's what we're going to be looking at. And when I say what is a crisis, I was looking at this slide yesterday saying it's an event that is unexpected, unavoidable, and overwhelming. It kind of isn't anymore. If you really look at school shootings, they aren't unexpected anymore. Mass gun violence is not unexpected anymore. And it's certainly not unavoidable. We've certainly learned an awful lot about what to look for in school shooters or in any mass shooting situation. But there's no question that it is overwhelming to the person that is in the situation. And if you think about anything that you've dealt with your clients or in your personal life, especially in your personal life, if you think about something that happened to you that you weren't expecting, and then you try to think back on it and think, well, what did they actually say to me? What actually happened here? You can't really always remember it very clearly. So, and that's important for you to keep in mind when you're dealing with anybody that is in this kind of a situation. Don't expect them to remember everything that you said, because they're not going to. Okay, this is a very, very iconic picture. This is the picture of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and it was taken on November 22nd, 1963. This was a very different time in our country. The Kennedys were visiting Dallas. Their parade route had been in the paper for days before this happened. So the people that were watching the parade knew exactly where this motorcade was going to be at any given time of the motorcade. And this is a very sad picture. This is President Kennedy here. He's already dead at this point. This is John Connally. He was injured. His wife was injured. These are the two poor guys driving the limo, who obviously know something's going on because they're trying to duck under the thing. And these are the poor Secret Service guys who are on motorcycles, who don't have any idea what's going on, who are trying to chase the car now. But I think one other time, and I believe I'm not going to say your name because my device will go off, but I believe the last time one of you who's here had told me that they had seen this picture before. What exactly, this is Jackie Kennedy, what exactly is she doing? What does it look like she's doing? Might not be what she is doing, but what does it look like she's doing?
Do you
It
want me
looks
to
like
answer?
I was going to say, she
Yes,
looks like she's trying
please.
to help.
I'm sure you're very annoyed since this whole thing happened with echoes and everything else, but if you had a middle name, it would be so much easier, but go ahead, tell us what you know about this picture.
This was right after he was shot, and she started reaching for fragments of his brain.
Yeah, that's exact. And I know you had said that before because I was watching a video when we did this the last time, and you had said you had seen this. Mrs. Kennedy, when he was shot in the back of the head, and a lot of his brain blew off, and it blew onto the back of the limousine. And she was trying to reach for the portion of his brain. Now, does this make any sense? When you really think this is an educated woman, she spoke several languages, she went to Vassar, she was incredibly intelligent and wealthy. Does it make any sense that she would be crawling onto the back of the limousine to try to find a portion of his brain?
Yes,
Chrissy,
I think it makes sense.
go ahead.
I think it's just a human reaction to try to put him back together.
Yeah. It does and it doesn't make sense, because obviously you're not going to take somebody's brain and stick it back on their head. She does not remember anything about this, or I mean, obviously Mrs. Kennedy is dead now, but she, after this, did not remember anything about doing this. This guy over here is the Secret Service. This man retired a couple years ago, and he went on the lecture circuit talking about this day. They did not know what had happened. Lyndon Johnson was in a limousine 2 cars back, and they're all open limousines. Do you think they do that now? You know what the presidential car looks like now? It's like an armored tank. But then these were all wide open. Everybody knew where they were going to be. Lyndon Johnson was 2 cars behind, and he was not injured. But this guy had to crawl onto the back of the limousine and try to push her back into the limousine because he didn't know what she was doing. He thought she was trying to get away. And she, in some portion of her brain, may have been trying to get away. But the reason I always show this is that if anybody should have been able to withstand a situation like this and figure it out, this woman was highly intelligent. But in that moment, she thought, if I can get that brain, I can save my husband. He was already dead at that point. But this is really a really good example of fight, flight, or freeze. She was kind of in flight mode, and she was trying to tell the Secret Service man that she was reaching for his brain. And the Secret Service guard that I showed, the Secret Service man that I showed you before, I just saw he was on one of the morning shows, and he said he had PTSD from that day for years and years after that. Because remember, the Secret Service, their whole job is to protect the president. That's what they're there for. And this was in a very different time when they were in open motorcycles. They didn't know who was being shot at. They didn't know why. They were just trying to prevent her from being killed, and felt that they had failed. He certainly didn't fail. He got her back into the limousine where she might have been injured or killed if she had fallen off the limousine. But in his mind, he felt like he had not done his job. But she was definitely in some kind of flight mode. So, you know, Christy's kind of saying the other side of it. Maybe she thought she could help. I think she did. But was it a rational thought? No, you're not going to put somebody's brain back into their head. That picture, I use it a lot. I mean, I was in high school when that happened. It was a very difficult time, but it really is the best example I can show you of fight, flight, or freeze. So let's talk about freeze, fight, or flight, because what happens to your brain during a crisis is what happened to Mrs. Kennedy, which is why she couldn't remember it after it happened. And she could not remember it. The Secret Service people that she was trying to talk to afterwards were able to remember what she said, but she did not remember anything about it. So in a way, she almost shows us everything. She showed us freezing too, because she did end up freezing. But what is freeze, fight, or flight? Let's look at the things that you do. You're driving home and the car swerves right into you and crashes into you. So what do? What's your first thought in a situation like that? You can think this can't be happening, and you can just freeze. You can just stop. There are some of the car accidents that you see have got a lot of elements of freeze in them, because a lot of people, when they see a car coming at them, do freeze because they don't know what to do. Or you can think, oh, he can't do that to me, and you can fight. Or you can get out of the way. You can flee. Now, do you pick this? Do you say, okay, I'm in a car accident, there's a car coming towards me. What do you think I ought to do? I think maybe I'll flee. You don't get to pick it. Those of you who know anything about the polyvagal theory, the reptilian brain has this whole thing in it. That's why possums freeze. That's why you see, I think I said in one other time, I was watching a squirrel out the window here, and obviously there was a hawk overhead, because the hawk hangs out on the pole up there, and the squirrel froze because he didn't want the hawk to get him. And he froze for an abnormal amount of time. He got up on his hind legs and just stayed there, and he was in freeze mode. Animals do it, we do it, and we don't get to pick it. what happens when your brain is processing a crisis is that this part of your brain is going to shut down. That's why Mrs. Kennedy couldn't remember what happened, because the thinking brain is going to shut down. And you all know, because we talk about the brain all the time, that the sensory part of your brain, the amygdala, is the part that's going to take over. You are at that point going to be operating in amygdala mode. And you're not going to be thinking, well, I think this car is coming towards me. I think I better get out of the way. That's not what you're going to do. You're just going to go into whatever part of that brain chooses, and your brain is not choosing it. So, but you have to remember when I say the thinking part of your brain shuts down, for those of you who work, I'm thinking especially of our colleagues here that are working at FUMSH, when you have kids that go into absolute trigger mode, we don't see it so much in outpatient, but the people who work at the children's home probably see it all the time. Because kids who go into trigger mode, kids who blow up, you can't sit down and say, now calm down, honey, because you might as well waste your wind. They're not going to calm down. Their thinking brain is not processing what you're saying to them. And with a lot of the kids that I've worked with over the years, after a blow up, after they've broken a window, after they've knocked over the furniture, after all of these things have happened, they cannot tell you exactly what happened. I'm thinking actually of one instance in particular that I think I've talked to some of you about before, and it was in Bacon Cottage on the FUMSH campus. At the time, I believe it was a therapeutic group home for boys. And I watched this on the camera after it was over because it was Christmas time. Something happened. He was 15 years old. He was a really big kid. He was sitting in the couch in the living room. Staff person came out of the office, and I don't know what was said because there was no auditory on the film, but he put his hand on the kid's shoulder, and whatever transpired between the two of them, the kid blew up and completely destroyed the living room of the cottage. It was Christmas time. He knocked the Christmas tree over. He knocked the couch over. He ripped the fabric that was under the couch. He ripped it out, took everything that was in the drawers, and it was puzzles and games and things, and threw them all over the floor, broke the window. And in the meantime, the staff person's back in the office calling 911 to try to get the law enforcement over there. Completely destroyed the living room of this cottage. And when he was done, he went out and sat on the steps of the cottage and waited for law enforcement, because by now he's untriggered. He's kind of looking around thinking, what just happened here? Because his thinking brain had shut down at that moment. So be thinking about that when you're thinking about the kids that you're working with. Because I know I'm looking at Christy, because I know you've had a couple of instances lately where you've had kids that have really pretty much been in crisis and not thinking all that clearly. And Christy's handled those situations beautifully, but you have to understand, and I think Christy did, that at the moment she was trying to deal with these particular youngsters, they were not processing things cognitively. So it's important for us to understand this whole concept. And you did do a beautiful job, Christy, by the way. Did somebody want to say something?
Yeah, it's Carol.
Oh.
I was just thinking, when you're talking about the accident and people not choosing how they're going to react. Because when I've worked with people that have been in vehicle accidents, some will say, everything went so fast, I didn't know what happened, or everything was in slow motion, that they could say everything, they could see their faces in the other vehicle. And so there's all kinds of different takes on what had happened through that time.
It's interesting. What Carol's saying is really interesting when you think about the brain and think about what you're kind of describing is very sensory. I could see their faces. They were coming towards me. They weren't fast. They weren't slow. They were going in slow motion. Maybe they were someplace that they weren't really, because their faces were not in the front seat of the car with you. And that's what I mean about trying to reprocess things when you don't have cognitive functioning at the time. And it's really important for those of you who are working with kids, especially kids in crisis, to understand that when they tell you what happened after the fact, it may not have anything to do with what actually happened at the time. So that's a good example, Carol. Thank you. The run, hide, fight scenario, I'm just going to show you this real quick. There's all kinds of these on YouTube because every campus police have put out these videos. Some are better than others. But the whole run, hide, fight adaptation really comes out of the freeze, flight, or fight. And it really, for those of you who are working in schools, you know that the schools do drills. The schools are really working with kids on these things to try to teach them to run, hide, or fight. And fight has got to be the last option because let's face it, in all of these situations with school shooters, who are the ones that end up getting killed? They're really the ones that are trying to protect other people. So this is not too long. I'm just going to show it to you real quick.
For 150 years, Wayne State University has been part of the fabric of Detroit, a beautiful 200-acre campus of green space and walking paths. Our history is filled with tradition and our future with promise. But it's important that all of our students, faculty, and staff are familiar with the actions they must take when confronted with a threatening situation. If someone with a weapon is on our campus and is intent on causing bodily harm, it's imperative that you're prepared to make a rational decision that can help you remove yourself from a potentially dangerous scenario. Wayne State Police conduct hours of rigorous training in order to effectively respond to any emergency situation. It's one of the reasons why we can proudly say we have one of the safest campuses in Michigan. An incident like this can happen anywhere, but remember, there's very little chance that you'll ever face this kind of threat. Nevertheless, it's important to be prepared. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to an active shooter scenario. A crisis situation can occur without warning, and every situation's different. There are 3 simple actions to remember if you're ever in the vicinity of an attack. Run, hide, fight. These steps remind you what to do and when to do it, and can increase your chances of survival. At Wayne State, we built text message alerts into our communication. Our job during an emergency is to deliver a campus-wide message to students, faculty, and staff. Your job is to act fast. If you hear what sounds like gunfire, stay calm.
Was that fireworks?
I think that was a gunshot.
Identify if you're in immediate danger. Leave your belongings behind.
Leave it. We need to go.
Your first plan of action should be to run. Evacuate the area as quickly as possible. Figure out the fastest, safest way to get out of that area. It could be a stairway, a window, or a door. When you're finally in an area, on campus or in Midtown, where you feel safe and sheltered, call the Wayne State Police Department. We recommend that all Wayne State University students, faculty, and staff sign up for broadcast messaging directly to your cell phone. You'll receive a text the instant Wayne State's crisis team notifies the university about any potential threat. Go to wayne.edu/safety to sign up. In some situations, running from the scene isn't the best option and could be dangerous. When that's the case, find a safe place and hide.
What the? Did you just get this?
Try to identify where the threat is taking place.
Oh my God, there's someone out there with a gun.
As quickly as possible, block entry points to the area where you're hiding. Lock or secure the doors as best you can. Make the room you're in appear to be unoccupied. Turn off the lights, silence your phone, then remain calm. Stay still and keep quiet. Remember to stay in your secure area until law enforcement arrives.
We haven't got the all clear yet.
Don't leave. Even if you don't hear any activity, you could be walking right into a danger zone. We call this sheltering in place. When you can't run and you can't hide, when you're left with no other options, only then do you fight. Wayne State Police emergency response time is less than 90 seconds. Statistics show that active shooters are neutralized within the first 2 to 5 minutes of an attack. So from the time a call is made, action is taking place on multiple levels to reduce and ultimately eliminate the threat on campus. When you hear it,
Hey, did you hear that?
that's when it's time to react.
We gotta do something.
Find anything around you that's heavy enough to use as a weapon. A phone, a heavy book, a fire extinguisher, or a pair of scissors, whatever it takes to provide you with some form of protection. And remember, one of your best lines of defense is the element of surprise. As a team, you stand a better chance of subduing the attacker than working alone does. Distract the attacker by throwing something across your path away from your classmates that are lying in wait. Working together can overpower the attacker. With the attacker down, hold them there as best you can. Call Wayne State Police and don't let your guard down. Keep the attacker incapacitated until police arrive. No matter if you run, hide, or fight, it's important to know how to respond when law enforcement arrives. Remember to remain calm and follow officers' instructions. Officers won't always know who the bad guys are, so if told to do so, raise your hands and don't make any quick movements toward an officer. The entry team is there to eliminate the attacker, not to evacuate people from the scene or cater to the wounded. All you need to do is let them finish the job. Congratulations. By watching this video, you just took an important step towards being better prepared if you're ever faced with an active shooter, here on campus or anywhere. This is a frightening scenario, and no one wants to think about making these kinds of decisions. But we're all better off knowing what to do if an attack happens. Remember, the key to saving your life and the lives of others is rooted in 3 words: run, hide, fight.
Okay, I don't know if any of you can hear that, but the roofers are now right over my head, so I'm hoping we can get through this. What I want you to know about the whole run, hide, fight thing is that it really was a very good way to help kids or anybody in a situation like this to stay in the thinking part of their brain, knowing what they have to do and how they have to do it has saved a lot of lives in the last couple of years. So that's really why I think that is so important that the schools do train and that they do drill the kids. I know it's hard for the kids. I know it's hard for the parents to have their children go through it. But in situations where we've seen in the last, and we've certainly seen enough of it in Florida with the Parkland and with Nicholas Cruz and then with the Crumbleys and all of that, that those people who were able to get away are the people who knew what they were supposed to be doing to not get caught in that whole freezing situation, but to run and to get away from the situation. So that's why I like to have you keep aware of that. So what is our response to situational crises? I mean, we've all had them. We all have situations where we've lost somebody, or certainly the Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd situation. Most typically it's the mass shootings that are situational crises. And in situational crises, not everybody involved in it is going to be reacting in the same way at the same time. If you consider yourself first responders in these situations, it's good to kind of position your brain to say, I am in the role of a first responder because you are trained. And if you're in a situation where you have people in crisis, it's important for you to know, what is my job here? That's why the run, hide, fight thing is really important for school personnel to know. They need to know where they're supposed to be. I'm thinking most recently the Nashville, the religious school where the principal was killed and the girl was there with the weapon. When the police got there, if you watch the police videos, if you watch the police body cams, those teachers knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing. They're in a religious school in the middle of Nashville. Sure, the last thing they thought was going to happen was that there would be an active shooter on their campus, but they had trained for it. They didn't panic. You could see them all standing in different places, directing the police officers so that they knew exactly where to go. Now, unfortunately, that shooter was killed. And unfortunately, there were, I believe, 4 children killed and the principal. But it could have been much worse because the teachers knew what to do with the kids. They knew how to get them out. They knew when they needed to hide. If you listen to teachers who are interviewed afterwards, they know very well now that if they get their kids hidden, maybe in a closet or someplace, turn off the lights where the shooter can't get in, they've saved a lot of lives by drilling that way. So, but you think of yourself as a first responder. What are you going to do? What is your response to this? The first thing you really have to do is, whether you're dealing with one person or many people, is that you have to assess your clients for safety. And you need to make sure that they know that you are there. You need to allow a client in a crisis to be able to tell you their memory of the event, and then you have to figure out what kind of long-term supports you need to put into place. So when we get into the NOVA model, I'll show you how that all fits together. And they're right over my head now, so we'll do the best we can. So what about a situational crisis that involves a group of people? Well, the one that we know the most, if you follow the Nicholas Cruz sentencing at all, which was recent, is the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting. And obviously that was a really, really terrible one, and 17 people were killed, and many people were injured. And then when we go through, if you watch, we do try to follow some of this. If you watch these parents who were now in Nicholas Cruz's trial and then in his sentencing hearing, these parents and these family members are reliving this over and over and over again as we go through all of this testimony. The Las Vegas concert mass shooting, huge mass shooting. And one, oddly, that we have no idea why that guy did that. We've certainly developed a protocol, haven't we, for the school shooters? They're usually loners, they've been bullied. They put their intentions out on social media. If you're paying attention, you're going to know that they're going to do it before they do it. But wasn't this guy in his 60s? I think he was in his late 50s or early 60s, had no profile for anything, had a girlfriend that he sent away so that he could then check into this hotel and do this, and then killed himself. So, and certainly the Surfside Heights condo collapse was a pretty tragic situation. Enough to make you not ever want to buy a condo in South Florida. The only reason I show this video is because this is about the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school shooting. And it was the day that this happened. This was not a news report from South Florida. It's from Australia. And I think that people in other countries think we are absolutely crazy that we have all of these things. And clearly this newscaster does as well. But in the course of one day, they have sent a reporter all the way to Florida from Sydney, Australia, to report on this because other countries don't have the kind of mass shooting that we do.
He's a teenager described as absolutely pure evil. Nicholas Cruz planned to inflict maximum damage at his high school in Parkland, Florida, setting off a fire alarm to put children out into the corridors. He began to shoot. Tonight,
All right, I don't know if anybody else can hear that, but let me turn the sound up because I can't hear it.
he's a teenager described as absolutely pure evil. Nicholas Cruz planned to inflict maximum damage at his former high school in Parkland, Florida, setting off a fire alarm to flush children out into the corridors where he began to shoot. Tonight, 17 people are confirmed dead and more than a dozen injured.
From inside a classroom, the sound of mass murder.
He ran up and down the hallway, just banging and shooting into the classrooms. I just saw blood everywhere.
Desks used as shields as students frantically texted their parents. SWAT teams moving from room to room. Those who chose to run sprinted with their hands up, already trained on how to deal with this kind of emergency. Outside, helicopters, army tanks, and a parking lot triage, a war zone at Stoneman Douglas High School, next to a giant pile of backpacks.
We can't get to her. We can't get hold of her.
Have you called and you texted, nothing has come back?
Her boyfriend got shot. We heard.
This girl watched her teacher get shot.
We saw his body for like 30 minutes. We were just like praying and crying.
Dead bodies around the floor and blood all around the floor.
This teacher saved 19 students, pulling them into her classroom.
We sort of huddled, in the corner for a few minutes. And then I made the decision to move everyone to the closet.
It was around 2:30 when the rampage began. The gunman stormed the building wearing a gas mask and carrying smoke grenades. He set off the fire alarm to force students into the halls where he was waiting for them.
I heard 5 pops. And I was like, that's not a drill, or we never did a drill like that.
It was a full hour before the gunman was arrested and taken to hospital, and it was someone they all knew. Nicholas Cruz, 19, a former student expelled last year for behavioural problems. Teachers claim he was troubled and had been identified as a potential shooter.
We threw our kids through drugs and like that, saying that he was the one to shoot up the school.
Officials say he used an AR-15 rifle and had countless magazines. His Instagram profile showing he was obsessed with guns. Cruz chose February 14th to carry out what is now the country's 18th school shooting just this year. A Valentine's Day massacre that never should have happened.
I'm tired of praying. America, you're killing your kids. What are we going to do about this?
9 News correspondent Lizzie Pearl is in Parkland, Florida this evening for us. Lizzie, what more do we know about Cruz?
Yeah, good evening to you, people. The shooter is still being questioned as we speak. Investigators want to know all about his motive as well as the level of planning that went into this mass shooting. They are scouring his digital footprint, also looking at his social media posts, which have so far been described as very, very disturbing. Schoolmates of Nicholas Cruz have described him as a loner. Chillingly, many of them predicted that one day he may do something like this. And we will find out a whole lot more when he faces court tomorrow. The US President Donald Trump has offered his condolences to the victims and their families, but he has stopped short of bringing up gun control. Pete.
Okay, Lizzie, thank you.
Like I said, I think people in other countries just absolutely do not understand what goes on in our country. That's why they sent this poor girl from Sydney all the way to Parkland, Florida to report on this. But when you listen to what these kids said, obviously these kids were all in shock, but what were they talking about? What kinds of things did you hear them saying? about their reactions. What did they see? They kept, a couple of them kept talking about what they saw. What might they see in a mass shooting?
Bodies, blood. They were
Right.
describing exactly what they were seeing there.
Yeah, they, two of them talked about blood. There was blood everywhere. And one of them talked about the teacher was shot, or I think it was the coach. And they were not able to get to him, that he was dead, but they couldn't get to him. They weren't talking about things that they were processing cognitively. They were talking about things that they saw or heard. It's very hard to listen to a lot of the audio about the Parkland shooting because obviously these kids were terrified, and the teacher who talked about getting them all into the closet really was a hero. But again, they're trained to not go into panic mode. The teachers in the schools now have a whole level of job that they didn't have a few years ago, protecting kids from being murdered. And they've done exceptionally well. But when you listen, if you watch any of this stuff on YouTube, and I know it's hard to watch, but if you watch it, what they talk about is what they saw, what they heard, what they smelled. And you're going to see that if you get into the critical incident stress debriefing, that you're going to work with sensory memories more than what actually happened. So if we're looking at large scale crises are usually sudden and unexpected. This is a picture of Newtown. I don't use a lot of pictures of Newtown because I find it still, all these years later, so hard to look at it, so hard to process it. But this is a picture, and I remember Newtown was really the first big mass school shooting that involved very young children. The other ones that involved high schools, Columbine was a high school, Parkland was a high school, Oxford was a high school. This was an elementary school. These kids were in kindergarten and first grade. And there were 20 children killed in the Newtown thing. But if you look at this picture, this was before these teachers were trained on how to do this. But look at the pictures, look at these kids' faces. I mean, this little girl here is obviously completely terrified. And these little boys here just look puzzled. They look like, what's going on here? Which is kind of the difference between the way boys process things and the way girls process things. But this little girl obviously is very, very frightened. These kids back here don't know what's going on. This, you can't see this whole picture, but this was a teacher. And she was trying to get them all out of the school. And again, this is before these people were trained in how to do this. The principal was killed because the principal was trying to fight. The principal was running towards. But hold on a second. Kevin, can I give you a call back when I'm on my break? I'm in the training.
Let me call you back because I'm going into a meeting. So I'll call you back later on.
Okay, very good. Thanks, bye. Sorry. But this really is a good example of if you have a group of kids that are in crisis, they're all in different places, aren't they? Some of them are scared, some of them don't know what's going on. And they didn't know what was going on. They just knew that they were frightened. It's hard if any of you watched the Crumbly sentencing trial when Ethan Crumbly was sentenced and then subsequently his parents were sentenced, they kept playing the video of Nicholas Cruz being in the school and rolling up and down and killing these people. And everybody was in different places in that courtroom. And the poor attorney, who I don't know, this poor girl was sobbing. And she kept saying, but I never saw this before. The prosecution had seen it several times. So they were able to kind of step back and not get upset because they'd seen it, they'd processed it, they'd gotten through the sensory stuff, and they were able to look at it. She couldn't look at it at all because she'd never seen it before. So if you're dealing with a large group in a crisis, just be aware that everybody may be in a different place. Let's talk about the immediate role of the intervener, because if there's one thing that we have learned in recent years is that first responders need to be taken care of after a crisis. I believe we are coming up on, how many years ago was Pulse? Because we're coming up to Pulse. Pulse was in June. And I'm trying to think of how many years ago Pulse was. But at the point that Pulse happened, we were not recognizing that first responders need to be taken care of after a response. And I think we absolutely do recognize it now. And if any of you are in a situation where you have to take over the role of a first responder because you're there and you're trained and people expect you to be a leader in situations like this, please recognize if you need to then step back and take care of yourself. Because what we see is that first responders have to assess for safety, and they often don't know what is going on. Many people who come into a crisis don't know what's happening. And we're just recognizing now that first responders have long-term effects of PTSD. And think back to where we first recognized this. 9/11 wasn't just the one day. It wasn't just 9/11. Those firemen, policemen, the people that were trying to clean up that debris, all ended up having severe PTSD. Many of them ended up sadly dying of lung diseases because of everything that they inhaled trying to do that. But we're really just beginning to recognize that first responders have to be taken care of. This fireman this is a picture from 9/11. And they just did it, didn't they? They didn't know what was going on. They went into the buildings. They didn't know at that point. If those of you who are old enough to remember 9/11, I realize that a lot of you are young, but we didn't know what was going on that day either. We didn't know until the second plane hit the second building, that this was not a horrible accident, that it was something planned. But those first responders had no idea. They just went into the buildings because that's what they're trained to do. And a lot of them died. But we need to recognize that. If I take it back to you guys, you need to recognize the need to take care of yourself after something happens. One of the young men from FUMSH who came over to talk to me after the security guard was killed had been there. The security guard's name was Mike, and he had been attacked by a youth and hit in the back of the head during the altercation. And to this day, I don't think we can be 100% sure what Mike died from, because there are some thoughts that he died of a stroke. The young man that hit him pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter. So it's a very confusing situation, but he died within the cottage. He was in Waller Jeter, which is one of the cottages. He came out of the kid's room. He'd been hit in the back of the head and he collapsed and he died in the hospital that night. The staff that were there, the one young man that came over to talk to me, they just kept going. The ambulance came, took Mike away, and they just kept going. And a couple of days later, it appeared that one of them was really, really struggling. And I don't even know how I got involved with this, but I think maybe somebody else, maybe one of the therapists in the cottage, I don't remember how it happened, notified me that one of the childcare staff was really having a hard time. So we had the young man come over, and it was almost like a little mini critical incident stress debriefing, because I said to him, this is not a therapy session. I just want you to tell me what's going on. And he could tell me everything he remembered from a sensory standpoint. He remembered that Mike began to slur his words. He remembered that Mike fell down. He remembered that that he was beginning to get a little bleary before he passed out. But the bottom line is that everything he was remembering, he kept saying, but I could have stopped this. If I had known, I could have helped him. Is that realistic? No, it wasn't. He couldn't have helped him. There was nothing that he could do. But in his mind, he was standing there, he could have done something. And that's what I mean about if you're dealing with an individual or a group like this, you're going to have to be prepared for kind of faulty thinking, faulty sensory memory. There was nothing that this young man could have done to save Mike's life, but he thought that there was something he should have done. So he was processing it in that sense. So I can't stress enough that we have to recognize the long-term effects from first responders, and we're really just looking at it now. You know, I don't, and this is going to say Pulse 1 year later, but I don't know when this was filmed. Does anybody remember? It was Pulse 5 years ago.
It was in 2016.
2016. So it was 8 years ago. Okay.
Yeah.
And one of the worst tragedies in America. So this would have been 2017.
The Pulse tragedy really shined a light on something that first responders have to deal with often, certainly in situations like this, PTSD, and it's something they really never talk about.
Absolutely right. And in fact, the wife of an Orlando police officer has really been at the forefront of this fight, trying to push state lawmakers to really recognize this as an illness that should be handled with dignity and, of course, some financial support. News 6 investigator Mike Holfeld joins us now with more on that effort. Mike?
Thanks, Lisa. Good evening, everyone. Listen, this is an important story to the entire community. Jessica Reeland's push for a state law to assist first responders actually diagnosed with PTSD fell short in Tallahassee. I don't know if you heard about that, but it fell short this session. But then a friend from Capitol Hill stepped in, and this issue is taking center stage.
It felt as though it wouldn't be turned down. We just ran out of time.
It's been a personal journey. Her husband, Jerry, was one of the first responders assigned to remove the dead from Pulse nightclub. He shared this hand-drawn sketch of the scene he recalled following Omar Mateen's vicious assault.
I could have never have trained for that. I mean, I've seen homicides and suicides before, dealt with it, but not like that.
Monday, April 17th, she traveled to Tallahassee with several other first responder families, all sharing stories of their loved ones' painful struggles with PTSD.
So that day, my husband left. And since that day, my husband hasn't come home.
The testimony was powerful. The committee approved it unanimously, but it never made it to the floor for a full vote.
Strong and compassionate.
A few weeks later, at a town hall meeting in Apopka, Reeland presented her PTSD fight to Congresswoman Val Demings. The former Orlando Police Department chief understood the Pulse legacy and told Reeland something could be done on Capitol Hill. Enter the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act of 2017, in part mandating states and local law enforcement agencies to establish peer mentoring mental health and wellness pilot programs, which would include treatment of PTSD.
Well, it's so important to take care of the ones who take care of us.
It passed the Senate May 16th. Now it's up to the House. Val Demings is one of 20 co-sponsors of that measure.
Out of the ashes, good things can come, and I couldn't be prouder of the place I call home.
And Representative Demings tells me she is optimistic this will pass the House. As we indicated, it already passed the Senate. If it passes on Capitol Hill, then it goes to the individual states to step up for our first responders. Reporting live, Mike Holfeld. Back to you, Matt, Lisa.
As I recall, when all of that happened, the clinical community, the mental health community in Central Florida was called upon to come down and help with that effort. And we had, I think, 3 people from Circle of Friends who were already involved in the Zebra Coalition, and they did go down and try to work with some of the first responders. But I think it's important just to recognize that you can be a first responder too, and you can get PTSD from something that you're trying to deal with. So make sure that you take care of yourself. So we're going to get into the critical incident stress debriefing portion of this. The first phase is assessing for safety. And sometimes when you are waiting for trained responders to arrive, you may be the only person there that can emerge as a de facto leader. So your job is really going to be to assess people around you for safety. When you see the teachers knew in those school shootings, they are very well trained in when to get kids out of the school, when to hide kids. They assess for safety. If you are the de facto leader and the trained responder hasn't arrived yet, you're going to have to do that yourself. So that's going to be your first priority. And in the situation where Mike died, there were kids in the cottage when this happened, and they were upset, but they're also kids, and they didn't know when he left that he was going to die. The staff did. And when the staff were notified later that night that Mike had passed away, they immediately went into a whole different level of shock, of why didn't we help him? What did we do wrong? And just trying to figure out, was there something else that they could have done? So I don't think it was I don't think the oversight on the part of the leaders was intentional. I think there were so many things going on at the time that maybe attention paid to those people in the cottage was neglected, but I don't think it was intentional. And I think we look back on it and talk about it because we don't want something like that to happen again. If you're in a school, when there's any kind of a school problem, we want you as our clinicians to know what you're supposed to do to keep yourself safe. So we talk about that when we talk about our protocols for working in schools, because we want you to always be thinking of your safety. If you can train your brain to use your prefrontal cortex, you won't go into sensory mode, and that's kind of what we're trying to get you to do. So the second stage of crisis intervention is really just helping the client move past that freezing stage. And you want to stabilize clients by allowing them to tell their story. And there are 3 phases to the critical incident stress debriefing that we're going to talk about. But one of them is safety. The other one is ventilate, allow the client to tell their story, and the third is prepare and predict. So we're going to help people to understand that what's going on with them is normal and it's okay. And when I say they have to tell their story, it doesn't mean they have to do a whole trauma narrative and tell you every single thing that happened. They just have to be able to talk about what's happened. The one thing I want you to get out of this too is that crisis intervention is not therapy. Crisis intervention is establishing safety, reestablishing the equilibrium of either the individual or the group that's in front of you, and prepare them for what's going to happen. It's really kind of important to be able to say to maybe a group of people like the staff at Waller Jeter after Mike died, you might have some PTSD about this. You may need to be able to go talk to somebody about this. The young man that came over to talk to me that day, I ended up referring him to a private therapist so that he could do some work. But my goal that day was not to establish a therapy relationship with him. It was just to see if I could get him to a place of safety. He had these thoughts that he was going to hurt his baby, and when he talked about it, he couldn't tell me why. So we really needed with him to get him to feel safe, to get him to feel that he had some support and that he had a plan. And that is kind of the goal of the NOVA model. So let's talk about the NOVA model. And you know what? It's 10 after 10. Before we get into the whole thing, because I want you to focus on how to do the NOVA model. That's the whole purpose of having you here. That I want you to come away with having this tool in your belt. So why don't we take a 10-minute break? Why don't you guys come back at 20 after? Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sometimes I can't get anybody to answer me. To put this back. Okay, I remembered it this time, so. Okay, can everybody come back to the land of the living? Carol and I were just talking at the break, and it is true. I mean, some of the stuff that we deal with every day, and some of the stuff that we talk about in trainings, is really difficult stuff. And when we talk about the school shootings, when we talk about Pulse, when we talk about any of the things that go on in our world, it also, we remember things that happened to us because I've been in this field for a very long time, and I have been an investigator. I've done removals. I've done a lot of stuff. You've all done a lot of stuff that probably your mother doesn't know you're doing or understand what you're doing, because it's not the world of the uneducated or the world of the uninitiated. We do stuff in our lives every day for these kids that other people would find very difficult to live through. So if this is difficult for you to listen to, if it's difficult to process some of this stuff, I think that's pretty normal. And I can tell you that even when I'm doing these trainings and when I talk about things that we've gone through, I can think back to things that I did. I can think back to removals. I can think back to going in and pulling a baby out of a mother's arms. And it's not fun stuff. And it's not stuff that you forget. It's just what happens is that you're going along, you're talking about something, and all of a sudden it just triggers it up and you remember it and you think, oh, did I do the right thing there? Was I as kind as I could have been? So if some of this does bring up stuff for you, I think that's pretty normal. And I think it's really good that we all hopefully have somebody that we can then talk to afterwards to say, this is how I felt when I was listening to some of this. So, and if you don't have somebody, you need to find somebody because this is not the easiest job in the world. Okay, let's look at the NOVA model for critical incident stress debriefing. It's called CISD. And this is the most frequently used model. And this was established a long time ago. There are other critical incident stress debriefing models. This is the most frequently used. And it was established many years ago. It was established way back in the 70s. And it was really designed for group intervention. The first time I was introduced to this actually was a long time ago. I think I might even have been working at a Florida United Methodist Children's Home then. Or maybe I was working at the Children's Advocacy Center, because even after I left FUMSH, I stayed in the building at Bruton and was there for another couple of years before I actually left. But I went to a week-long training in Seminole County to teach how to do this particular model. And it was right after the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. And the two law enforcement officers that were running the training had been sent to Oklahoma City to do critical incident stress debriefing with the first responders who at the time were in the building. And if you remember anything about that, the bomb went off near a daycare center in the building. So there were many babies that were killed in that particular instance. And so we spent a whole week learning how to do this. And I got to tell you, it was a long week because what she was trying to train us to do was community response after a crisis. And we had to practice death notifications. We had to practice going in and trying to help tell parents that their children were missing. It wasn't fun stuff. And then at the very end, we had to all get in a group. Now, most of these people were Seminole County law enforcement officers. And if you have law enforcement officers in your family, they are not known for being warm and fuzzy. That's not their training. Their training is to tough it out through things. But so she was going to show us how to do one of these debriefings. So we all get in this big circle. And she said, all right, I want you all to think of something that's happened to you. And you can share or you cannot share. But I'm going to introduce the topic and then I'm going to wait. And you have to be comfortable with silence because sometimes with first responders, it takes a long time for them to be able to share. So I thought, well, these are all law enforcement officers. Nobody's going to say anything. Well, I was very wrong because they had just had an officer killed. And in the group was the daughter-in-law of the officer who was killed. And I think a cousin, because, a lot of times law enforcement runs in families. So we all sit around, she introduces the topic, we think we're going to sit in silence. And one by one, they began to talk about the night that their comrade was killed. And they didn't talk about things that they said. They talked about the fact that they kept calling his radio and he wasn't answering the radio and that it was silence, that they would try to signal him on the radio and he apparently had already been shot and that he didn't respond. And then they would get up and leave the room and come back in and we would start again. So we went through that and then everybody in that room, probably with the exception of me, told all of these stories. One woman talked about how she had been raped by a neighbor and she never told anybody. And another young man talked about how he had been assaulted at a party and he had never shared that with anybody. And a lot of what they talked about was what they remembered seeing, what they remembered hearing, what they remembered smelling. And what I thought was going to be just sort of an exercise to show us how to do it was pretty darn grueling. So I gave that police officer, her name was Beth something, a lot of credit for managing all this, because I think she, at the end of the day, thought, I'm going to show them how to do this model. We're going to practice it. It's all going to be great. And we're all going to go home. And that's not what happened. So, so this is the most frequently used model, and it really it's very prescribed. I carried around this little card in my wallet for a long time because they gave us these cards at the training that there are three main tenets of the NOVA model. And the first is safety and security. The second is ventilate and validate. And the third is prepare and predict. And this is, if you're going to do this, you have to follow these steps because people cannot share unless they feel safe. So it's the same with your clients, isn't it? Isn't that the first thing that you do with your clients is to make them feel safe? If you follow this model strictly, you can say to your participants, I will have a room monitor outside the door. If you want to leave, it's perfectly fine. You can get up and leave, and there'll be somebody there to make sure that you're okay. We just ask that you don't leave the building. And you can come back in if you want to. You cannot come back in if you want to. But safety and security is the very first thing you have to assure. You have to say to everybody, this is not therapy. This is a way for you to try to deal with what has happened to you so that we can go on and help you to go forward. So you're going to assure safety. You're going to tell your participants that it's okay for them to tell what happened. You have to be able to allow people to process the sensory memories of their event. And this is where sometimes therapists have a hard time with this because we just let people ramble on, don't we? If they're talking, they're fine. But you need to make sure that once you've assured safety, that you tell them what the parameters are of ventilating, that you can process what you remember seeing, what you remember feeling, and this is how you're going to say it. Tell me what you heard, tell me what you saw, tell me what you smelled, tell me what your sensory memories are of this, because you don't want people to kind of wander off into therapy because that's not what you're there for. And then you're finally going to prepare and predict. You're going to prepare your participants that they're probably going to have this for a while. And that maybe we should talk about having you seek help beyond what this is going to do. The young man that came in to talk to me that day, he wasn't a group, he was one person. And we kind of did that. I had him in our play therapy room. I let him feel comfortable. I got him some water. I let him settle down a little bit. I told him that he would be safe in here and that anything he shared would be fine. And then I kind of guided him into telling me what happened or what he thought had happened. And then we talked about the fact that it sounded like he did have PTSD and that it might be a good idea for him to seek help. And then I helped set that up for him. So those are the three tenets of that model. It's not hard. It's safety and security, ventilate and validate, and prepare and predict. And like I said, I carried that little card around in my wallet for years and years. Because if you think about it, you have probably done some version of this with your clients or your family or maybe a friend at different times when people have gotten involved in situations and been upset. So if you just keep in mind that those are the three things that you're going to try to do in some fashion, and I'm going to tell you at the end how we ended up doing it here, quite unexpectedly in a Zoom call after the Ethan Crumbley situation happened at Oxford High. So again, these are the three tenets of this model, and you're going to let your client describe the crisis. You're not going to judge it. You're not going to analyze it. You're just going to allow them to say what happened. You always want to tell your group that this is not therapy. And why do we want to tell them that it's not therapy? Because therapy is an ongoing relationship. You're not there to be in an ongoing relationship. You're there to just help people kind of process where they are so that they can go forward. And that's why we have the safety protocol. That's why we say anybody can leave at any time. I've had this happen just in workshops, like at the summit or whatever, if we're going to be talking about a difficult topic. And maybe you have had that happen too in workshops where maybe the moderator might say, if you need to get up and leave the room, that's fine. Sometimes in our field, we can get triggered by things that we have experienced or we hear other people experiencing. So it's okay to say, you can get up and leave at any time. And there'll be somebody there who will come to you and say, are you okay? Because our main goal is to make you feel safe so that you can talk about whatever it is that you need to talk about. So the role of the moderator is to really control all this. And that's why, because you're a therapist, I know that your heads are kind of in a different place. That's why sometimes cops do this pretty well because they are very used to being in a certain zone. The one thing I will say about therapists learning this model is that we're therapists first and we're crisis interveners second. So you're going to be listening to people thinking, oh, your mind is going to be going, oh, this person really needs to talk about this and I really need to get to the end of this. That's not why you're going to be there. You're going to have to keep people on task while they're talking about things. The mock that I went through with all the police officers, I don't even think that the poor woman who was running this was planning on all this happening. But I would have to say she did a yeoman's job of keeping everybody on task, because the law enforcement officer was dead. He had been dead for about 2 weeks. He had been shot. He died from the wounds, and there were family in the room. So what I saw her doing, because I didn't think anybody else was going to talk in this room at this point, what I saw her doing was eventually taking them aside and guiding them into a therapeutic situation. But it's really important that you allow people to talk about what happened, and it's important that you predict what's probably going to happen. Because people, especially in our field, we don't think of ourselves as having PTSD. We don't think of ourselves as needing extra help. And then when we do need extra help, it's hard for us to get it, isn't it? We are, you know, the saying, "Doctor, heal thyself," we're the worst. And we don't always recognize when we need a little help. So how are you going to set this up? The reason you started off by saying, what did you hear? What did you see? What did you smell? What do you remember about what happened? Is that if you say, tell me what happened, there is a tendency for people to start to say, I was really stressed, I'm really scared, you know, and talk about the way they felt. What you want to do is to figure out what they can remember from their sensory memories. And there's a reason for that. That sensory memories are a little bit easier to access. Most of us are going to process a traumatic event through the senses. It's like when Carol gave a perfect example of saying somebody in an accident saying they were coming towards me really slow, or I saw their faces in the mirror, or it seemed like they were in the car with me, because the sensory memories can get really mixed up. But it's important for you to kind of figure out what the people, what state of mind is, and what you're trying to deal with. It's safer to talk about, I smelled this. I don't think we saw it in this video, but a lot of the videos that I've watched of the Pulse and Parkland, a lot of what people talk about is blood and the smell of the blood, because blood does smell and dead bodies smell. And I believe it was the officer that was in this video from Pulse. I can see why this man had PTSD, but he talked about getting in there. And it was interesting that you saw that he drew a little thing. He drew where the bodies were because he was trying to remember what he saw. So he drew a thing like a sketch of, I saw there was a body here, there was a body here. But he talked about getting in there and slipping on the blood, that he couldn't stand up because they kept slipping because there was so much blood. And he also talked about the smell, because by the time they got in there were, I think Carol texted me at the break, how many did you say were killed at that? I think you're muted. I know, I can never unmute this thing either. I can see she's struggling with that. Did you tell me there were 49 people killed at Pulse?
Yes, 49 killed, 53 wounded.
So part of what the officers were talking about is getting in there, number one, and seeing all this carnage, and then trying not to fall down because there was so much blood around. So that was what they were remembering. And they talked about the smell, that it smelled, and that they were having a hard time sorting some of that out. Easier probably than having them say, I've never experienced anything like that in my life. Now, that police officer was able to say that because it had been a while since this happened, and he was able to say, I was not prepared for that. But at the time, with some of the earlier video of him, he's talking about what he smelled and what he felt, and slipping and not being able to do things that he thought he was supposed to be able to do, and then not being able to unsmell it. That's the other difficulty with sensory memories, is that you can't unsee, you can't unsmell, you can't unhear. And sometimes they keep coming back. For those of you who remember 9/11, a lot of the first responders who were in groups after 9/11, you have to be careful when you're doing critical incident about distorted memories. And it is okay to challenge a distorted memory, because one of the things that would happen, and again, those of you who remember 9/11, when the towers came down, it was a tremendous amount of dust and noise, and people were running through the streets and trying to get away. But there were also a lot of very sad situations where people jumped out of the buildings. And because for whatever reason, people jumped out of the buildings. It is probably the purest example of flight, because the buildings were on fire. And there may have been some people that said, I'm just going to take this into my own hands and I'm going to die anyway. And there probably were people that were just in pure flight mode who jumped out of those windows and were killed. But people in the support groups after 9/11 would talk about the dust, because the dust was horrible. If you remember those pictures, there was the one famous lady who was completely covered in dust, and a storekeeper finally pulled her inside. She died not that long ago from lung disease, from everything that happened there. But there's tremendous sensory memories of 9/11. But then there are people who would say, but I remember hearing people calling out, and they probably didn't hear that. They probably thought they did because it was such a visual situation at the time. Those are probably distorted memories.
I have just a story about 9/11 because I was in New York City on the day that it happened. My brother is a retired NYPD cop, but at the time he was working down at Ground Zero afterwards. And I remember we met up with him and his wife probably like a month after it happened, and we were just going to dinner down in Tribeca, and we were standing outside of the restaurant, and he said to me, he's like, "Do you smell it?" And I said, "Smell what?" He said, "Do you smell the bodies?" And I was like, I didn't smell anything, but it's like he was carrying that smell with him like all over the city.
Yeah. Is your brother still retired? Is he retired?
He is retired now. But, this was back when, like you said, first responders were not recognized for having PTSD. So there was no support, it was just dealing with the nightmares. He definitely had it, but it wasn't like there was intervention for these first responders back then.
No, there wasn't. And thank you very much for sharing that. I think we've seen it evolving over time, but that was such a flashpoint because there were so many people, law enforcement, fire, people that were trained in the helping professions that did what they were supposed to do. And, but again, this isn't something that just happened on 9/11. It took months to clean that up. And those people were in the trenches. They kept finding body parts. They kept finding remains. They kept finding things that you would have on your desk. Remember, these were cubicles that were all blown apart. And look around at your own desk. If it got blown away and you had little things on your desk, a picture your child or whatever, they kept finding things like this in the rubble. And it was a constant washing back into it. But is your brother okay now? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think he is. I think it was tough at first. He didn't have, his sons weren't born at the time, so he's since had 2 boys, and I think he's okay. He's, you just don't know though. I think, like you said, they're tough. They don't really talk about their feelings very often, so.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, he's okay.
Well, look at all of the groups that we have ignored over time that needed help with PTSD. Look at the vets. Look at all of the vets from all of the wars that are still really not taken care of in the way that we should take care of people that have served our country. My father was a World War II vet. That generation didn't talk about it at all. By the time the Vietnam War came, They were very, very young. The Vietnam vets were young, and it was an era where a lot of them were abusing drugs, and they came back from that war with severe PTSD. And it's kind of when we began to recognize it, because for those of you who do remember this, we originally called this post-Vietnam stress syndrome. That was the coinage that we gave it at the time, because they were the first group of vets that were so openly traumatized by what happened to them. And I'm not 100% sure we're doing a whole lot better now, but people that, like your brother, that are in the helping professions, we're all trained to just do what we need to do, aren't we? We're trained to say, I'm going to rush into that burning building and I'm going to take care of that person. And I'm going to get these people out. And then when it's all over, we need to help our first responders and our helping professionals recognize when they need help. But that's a perfect distorted memory, what Christy is sharing. Because when he said it to you, he probably wasn't thinking that, why doesn't she smell that?
Yeah, he was so confident that everyone standing there could smell it.
You know, nobody deserved to have 9/11 happen. But I always said, if ever there was a group of people that could somehow survive 9/11, it would be New Yorkers. New Yorkers are very, very tough people. And I don't think I could have done what a lot of those people did.
Barbara.
Yes.
Hi. I don't know if you guys are familiar with a podcast that's called Life After PTSD. It's founded by a group in Orlando who has a program called MESSY, which is Managing Emotional States Effectively. And they look at PTSD as an injury instead of a disease. To them, it's an injury that can be healed. And so they utilize sort of the tool to try to, like a neurobiology tool, to try to help people through PTSD. It's a pretty cool podcast, and things that, I mean, that goes along with what we're talking about today that will be helpful for us all to look at. They do tend to work with the law enforcement that are here in Florida. And matter of fact, the gentleman that's over it, he was an ex-law enforcement person, and he's been on this whole program to try to help people heal through the PTSD that they've gone through. So I just thought it was appropriate to share the podcast on life after PTSD. And
Why don't you send me the link to it, and then I'll send it out to the group.
Okay.
And I agree. I think PTSD is an injury. It's an injury to your soul. It's an injury to your brain. And yes, you can heal from it, but we need to recognize it. And I think what happens is that people who are trained to help don't recognize when they need help themselves. So, but thank you for sharing that.
Barbara, I just wanted to share with the Twin Towers situation that those that had recovery with their animals after looking for live people, the animals after a period of time were not able to find people who were still alive, and they became very depressed because their handlers were not sure what was going on. And so they had to actually stage situations for the animals to go and find a live person in the rubble to get them out of their depression.
Oh my gosh, I have never heard that one before. That's amazing. Yeah, when we talk about these situations, I'm thinking about the Surfside collapse. That was a horrible situation, and they did use dogs and they used people, and those we knew we were not going to find any survivors in there. But I know that they used the dogs, and I know that there were difficulties with the dogs after a while. So that's why we call them man's best friend, I guess. But I had never heard that before. That's amazing. So I'm going to have to do a PTSD group when I get done with all this. I can see that. I know this is a tough topic. I am quite aware of that. So we look at de-escalation techniques, things that you just do automatically. And I put this in here because this is part of the NOVA model. You guys are already trained in all this, but a lot of people who do these groups are not. So you have to just stay calm. And I know that, you know, when we talk about our resting voice and our resting therapy face, and we all have one, it's one of the things that we talk to people who are learning this model, because you do it automatically. I'm sure you automatically maintain a posture and a tone with your people, and you're very respectful. And you're used to kind of staying calm when people tell you terrible things. But it is important that the moderators stay calm. Beth, the woman that was running this group that I went to, she needed a medal after she got done with that, because she stayed so calm during all of that. And she did share with us afterwards that she was not prepared to have people share to the extent that they did. She said, when I've done them for real, yes, but I thought this was going to be like a mock, and she wasn't prepared for that. But she maintained calm. She was always, her tone of voice was respectful. So she helped everybody stay calm. And again, you guys do this stuff all the time. You use active and reflective listening. You look for clarification. So what I'm hearing you say, or help me to understand a little bit more about that, or can say a bit more about that. You can guide somebody who's talking to you by saying, so what I'm hearing you say is that you are smelling bodies, in the case of Christy's brother. But there's nobody here. There are no dead bodies here. And it is okay to bring people back to reality. You don't want people to go off the deep end, saying, you know, I'm hearing voices. You want to try to help people to recognize that some of the things that they are hearing or seeing or thinking or sensing are a result of having been exposed to a terrible situation. And your job is to kind of help them get back to normalcy. And Shanice's point, I think, is that it is an injury and you can heal from it. And that's why we all do the things that we do, isn't it? That's why we all work with the kids that we work with. We know that they've all had terrible situations, and we know we can help them to come back from it. But we have to believe that ourselves. And I think you guys all know that you all know how to say the difference between I hear what you're saying and why you're frustrated. So I consider these the top tools of the crisis intervener, but I also consider that these are the tools that you have to do the job you do. If you didn't have these things, you wouldn't be in the job that you're in. But empathy and good listening skills and being able to be kind and consistent with somebody is very important. But the other part of crisis intervention is knowing when to say, I don't think you heard voices coming from the tower. I think that's just something that you thought you heard. But I can understand why you might have thought that, because it was a terrible situation. It's okay to challenge. It's okay to say it with kindness. It's okay to say to Christy's brother, there are no smell of dead bodies here, but I can understand why you feel like that, or why you think that. You have to kind of acknowledge that these kind of odd sensory reactions are not because this person is crazy. It's because they've gone through something that has gotten embedded in their brain and in their senses and in their amygdala, and now they're trying to sort out what's real and what's not real. And you also absolutely have to know when to take care of yourself. All right, let's talk right at the end here about the Crumbly case. We have followed the Crumbly case here at Circle of Friends very, very strongly, just because of the way this whole case has evolved. And because of the fact that the parents were eventually charged and found guilty But we began to see that there was a pattern for school shootings. There's a profile of the shooter, access to weapons. Ethan Crumbley did all of this. He announced his intentions on social media. He posted pictures of guns. He told his parents that he was hearing voices. He drew things on his school math test saying that he was going to shoot somebody. There were many, many opportunities in the Crumbley case to intervene in advance. Frankly, I think we've learned a lot. If we're going to learn from something, we've learned a lot from this case, but it doesn't help the parents of the kids who were killed by Ethan Crumbley because they have had to relive this over and over and over again. But this is what made this case different. And we've all, I don't know if I've seen this picture about 1,000 times at this point. But what did make this case different? This case was different because the parents were charged and they were charged with being at fault. Whatever you think about this case, and there are many opinions about this case, these parents were eventually tried and convicted of 4 counts each of involuntary manslaughter. And that's a very new concept. And they were the first parents to be charged in a school shooting. For a subject for a different training for a different day, this has implications for what you all do in your work every day with kids and their parents. Because what did we learn as this case has evolved? We learned that we could be held accountable for our work with parents around situations like this. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. How did this affect the therapeutic community? If you followed this case at all, the school social worker is the one, I think he was a social worker. He was a guidance counselor. He was a helping professional. He's the one who called the parents to the school to say, you need to take care of your son. He needs to get mental health help immediately. And then he let the parents go because they wouldn't take the boy home. But he was called to testify, and his testimony was televised nationally. This was a guy who'd probably never been on the witness stand before. And he had to get on and explain why he let the parents leave that day and why Ethan went back to class. Ethan went back to class, went into the bathroom, took the gun out of his bag, came out and killed 4 people. Public opinion has really blamed that social worker. And I have my own thoughts about that. But right now there are civil suits pending against the Oxford School Board and all the involved personnel. This social worker, his name is Sean Hopkins, has been put on leave since this happened. He just testified again and said he was on paid leave, but he's on leave and probably it's going to be the end of his career. So what we learned from this is that we can be held liable, that helping professionals learn from this case that we can be held liable for our efforts to help people that eventually commit criminal actions.
I think you went on mute.
I'm sorry?
I can hear you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I can hear you too. Christy, can you still hear her?
I can hear now. Maybe it was my connection.
Oh, okay. Don't scare me. The reason that I put this at the end of this training is that we have had to learn how to behave ethically in these situations and how to protect ourselves. But what we ended up doing is that on March 3rd of 2022, I just put out a flyer and I just said to all of our mailing list and said, why don't you join us for a roundtable discussion about lessons learned from the Crumbley case? Well, the roundtable turned into a critical incident stress debriefing for helping professionals, because from the minute we put that out, our phone started ringing here. And in the first day that we put out this flyer, we had 40 different people call us saying, can we come into this discussion? Now, I think we've kind of settled down a little bit since then, and we've kind of learned a little bit about it. But, and this is why I'm saying you can use a critical incident stress debriefing in all kinds of ways. I did not intend for this to turn into a CISD, but I had all these people on this Zoom call, many of whom I didn't know, from agencies that I didn't even know the agencies. But everybody wanted to talk about what was our responsibility as helping professionals in these cases. Were we going to be held accountable? Why was Sean Hopkins held accountable when he thought he was doing the right thing? Why is he being sued 3 years later? What's going to be the end of his career? So what ended up happening with all of these people is that we kind of talked about how are we going to keep ourselves individually and our agencies safe in these cases? What is going to be our responsibility? I can tell you what Circle of Friends did is that we as a management team put together a whole policy and procedure around how we're going to take care of these cases. And it involved, if we get a referral, what questions are we going to ask before we take the referral? What safety plans are we going to put in place for our therapists? For example, one of the things that I've said to the therapist is that if you get into a home and there are guns displayed, you leave the home. We talked about what is your responsibility to keep yourself safe if you go into a school. If you go into a school, make sure that the door is locked behind you. If you go into a school, know where your closest exit is. Know how you can get out of that school safely if you have to. Those were things that we had not talked about before, but we talked about our professional responsibility to keep us safe. There was a lot of people frustrated at that point, a lot of people from different agencies who said that they had never thought about it, that their management people had never thought about it, that there wasn't any plan to keep helping professionals safe in a school setting or going into a home where there might be an active shooter. So we talked about our safety. There was a lot of frustration about people saying, well, you know, my agency isn't keeping me safe. I don't know what to do. And I think the discussion ended up to be fruitful because we did have a subsequent one where people came together and said, okay, our agencies have now come up with protocols for how to deal with this. And that's what we want. We want to learn from things that have happened to us. But the predictive part of this was that these cases are not going away. I don't think we've had a school shooting in 2024, have we? It seems odd to say that, but I don't think wasn't the Nashville one last year? I think that was the last one. If anybody can Google it.
I'd have to look at that, but I know just recently, like a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a week ago, in Wisconsin, in a small town by Madison, that they had killed a young man who was going to the school with a gun, but they killed him before he entered the school.
Yeah, I think I did see that. It almost sounds like as we have done all this work, and I'm proud of the work that we did with this. As we've done all this work and we've come up with the protocols for what we're looking for and how we might prevent these things from happening, all of these shootings have been preventable. In all of these situations, the shooter has pretty much announced that he was going to do it. And actually the young lady who the Nashville shooter is the first time we've had a girl, and I believe she was transgender. But we have protocols. We know what we're looking for. So hopefully some of this has helped us. But in this situation, and I didn't realize it until we were done, but we did safety, we did ventilation, and we did prediction. And I think we had some good come out of it because, like I said, we had a subsequent conversation. We set up a subsequent roundtable, And some of the people who came back in were able to say, this is what my agency did, and this is how we are going to protect ourselves. We also set up some really firm protocols to protect you as therapists, that you're going to document what you've done in certain ways, so that if anything comes back to bite us, we can say, well, we did document this. We had one young man here, he was 13, and we had, I think it was Robert, one of our therapists here, who tried to set up services. Boy was living with grandparents. Grandparents would not cooperate, but we made sure that we tied those knots up pretty tight, that we documented that we made attempts to get the boy open. We went back to the school that referred him to begin with and said we weren't able to do this. And I remember the guidance counselor at the school said, I've got this all in his record, and I have a feeling that we're going to be seeing him again. So, but I didn't want anybody to come back to Circle of Friends and say, your therapist didn't do what they needed to do. So I think at this point, for us as helping professionals, we're just trying to make sure that we're doing the right thing and that we're documenting it and that nothing will come back to bite us. But we're in a kind of a different stage of working with people. But these cases are not going to go away. They're not going to go away anytime soon.
In Education Week, they're reporting that there's been 15 school shootings in 2024. The latest situation was on May 7th, and it was a student was injured when a gun misfired from another student's backpack. And oddly enough, it's Parkland High School in North Carolina.
May 7th, that was 2 days ago.
Yeah.
Wow.
I
Well-
just also want to bring up an incident like that I had and kind of talk about like really quickly what I did with it. Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
So I had a student who, we get into session and he told me that the day prior that there was a lockdown in the school because one student had brought a gun to school, and I guess another student had put it in his backpack, and then had I guess, I don't know if there was some sort of struggle or fight or whatever, but then another third student got the gun from that student, and that all three were suspended or whatever. And I guess what happened was the father of the initial student that brought the gun to school realized the gun was missing from his home and called the school. So this is sort of how it all, but so I heard the story from my student who was not connected, but in my head, I was like, did this really happen? Or because you never know, are they trying to tell you something that maybe they know somebody that has a gun? You know what I mean? And I that was sort of like a confidentiality situation in my head. So I said, how can I figure out, did this really happen? Or is he trying to tell me something? Anyway, I just went up to a cop at the, one of the school resource officers and asked him, was there a lockdown yesterday? And the school resource officer explained everything that had happened, which was matched with what the kid told me. But you know what I mean? It was one of those situations, you just don't know, are these kids, do they know something? Are they? So, but also that would have been good information for me to know that this had happened before I came into the school. I had no idea. And I'm in that school 2 days a week, so I don't know. I just thought that was relevant to this. How do you handle that without breaking confidentiality, but then it's I don't know. I'm rambling.
No, I think you're rambling because it is difficult, and going into the schools now is a whole different thing than it used to be. I mean, Christy, we never had to tell the therapist, make sure you know where the nearest exit is. Make sure that you know that the door is locked behind you. Make sure that you know that there are certain protocols if you have to get involved in a drill. That's not stuff that we used to talk about. But going into schools is a whole different thing now. And if you have children in the schools, they will tell you that the drills are very frightening for them. But hey, look, these kids know what they're supposed to do. If something happens, they know that if they're going to run, they have to hold their hands up in the air. They know that if they're going to hide, that they're going to hide in the closet and they're not going to come out until law enforcement gets there. It's just a different level of awareness that we did not have to have before. And to go back, to the point of this training. If you guys are involved in situations that cause you stress and you recognize that, make sure you talk to somebody about it, because I've been doing this for many years, and it is not something that I used to experience on a daily basis. You guys experience it on a daily basis now. And you recognize when you're trying to de-escalate kids that maybe they're not thinking with their thinking brain. You recognize, it's like Christy said, maybe they're just trying to tell me something because they're afraid and they're just trying to let me know that something's going on. It's a very different level of awareness than we used to have. It just adds a different layer to our job, and one that we have to be aware of. So, okay, that last slide just said take care of yourself, and I honestly think you guys need to be aware of that and take care of yourself. So, does anybody else have anything that they want to add?
May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is something, because we were talking about, I know a lot of these school shootings and stuff, and I was on TikTok and I was scrolling and I saw this thing, and it was a whiteboard that I can't remember what state they're implementing them in, but it's a whiteboard that goes in the corner. So it's 2 full walls and there's a handle on it, and you grab it, and with hinges, it pulls out into a bulletproof room.
This is on TikTok?
Yeah, but it was referencing, I looked into it, referencing an article that was done on preventative measures in some states for school shootings. Like this, like again, it was an actual thing. I looked into it. I just can't remember where the website was. But it was just one of those wake-up calls where it's just like, this is a real thing that we have to have for some reason. And I'm a huge South Park fan. And there's an episode of South Park, and if anyone has kind of that darker sense of humor, I recommend it. But the parents are freaking out. They're like, "Oh my God, there's a shooting," and the kids are acting like nothing's happening. And they're like, "Yeah, this happens like 3 times a week." And it's unfortunate that we're getting there, that it's becoming so desensitized. Like, oh, someone has a gun. We know what to do. Let's go. It's scary.
Yeah, yeah. It is, and we are in this reality right now. So, but okay, what I would have to say is that I want you to come away knowing that if you have to use that model, just make sure you use those three tenets. Make sure you use safety and security, ventilate and validate, and prepare and predict in whatever fashion you want to do it. Whether you want to do it in a group in Bacon Cottage, or you want to do it with your kids on one-on-one, that's the model, and there's a reason for it. So, and when I tried to train all of my people on this the last time, it was with the thought that we could offer these services to the school, which in fact we did to the Seminole schools. And, but they fortunately haven't had a school shooting to necessitate using it. But when you hear about something happens, and you always hear that counselors are on board, counselors are at the school. What are the counselors doing? I'm not sure. But there's a reason that people look for professional help after stuff like this happens. So I want you guys to be at the forefront of it. I want us to be able to offer the service if we need to. We put the protocol in place for how we're going to accept these services. And I want you to be able to be skilled enough to do it if we do get called on to do it. So anybody else have anything that they need to say?
I put that link because I guess I didn't do a good job of explaining it, but I put an 11-second video in chat of this bulletproof whiteboard that now we have to have, and it's scary that we've gotten there.
It is scary. I agree. So, all right, you guys, those of you who need CEUs, I'll probably be doing that tomorrow morning. The rest of you will get training credits for the FUMSH people, and for Joy, I will send you certificates. Okay, have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, you too.
Have a good day.
you.